Introduction. Many of us sincerely want to end wars on this planet. But how can we if we don't truly understand how they are created? In this summary, Mr. Keshe has revealed to us the hidden causes of many wars, and especially now what is going on in Ukraine. When we saw the Pope rushing off to the Russian embassy the night before the conflict started, most of us believed what the media told us, that he was on a mission of peace. But now we find out that the truth is quite the opposite. It was said that we as knowledge seekers will start to rule this planet through our souls. In a way, we have a responsibility to understand the situation clearly and then use our souls to create the fields needed to come to a correct balance. It doesn't matter if we are a housewife or a politician. Our souls are equal in their ability to change the conditions of this planet. So please, everybody, do not be afraid to read this document and understand the truth, so that when we make our intentions together to bring peace on earth, it will have a tremendous power. We are all equal, regardless of what we are being told. The truth of the Pope's visit to the Russian embassy was actually one of defeat. He went there to guarantee that Russian forces will not cross the Ukrainian border, and he has agreed to pay for all the costs of the war, because all the leaders know that he is the guilty party and has to pay the penalty. Just to hear this is so crazy. How can the world be turned so upside down? How can all of us have been so fooled by the temporary controllers of this planet? Basically, the Pope was lusting after the gold of the Russian Orthodox Church, which has more wealth than the Catholic Church. The Vatican has been financing American and European organizations to go into Ukraine and destabilize the government and put their own people in places of power through bribery and other promises. Finally, the Russian Church had to make a move or be taken over by the Pope. This is why Mr. Keshe says that this is not a war, because when you take back your own property, you are correcting the situation. This is not the first time, but it is an ongoing pattern of the Vatican. The Vatican succeeded in what you could call a corporate takeover of the Church of England. Then there was Libya, but the Vatican was betrayed by the British. The Vatican sent African priests into China with bags of diamonds to split up China, but the Chinese contained it in Hong Kong. They also collaborate with the Rothschilds family financially, as they have the same goals to control humanity, but sometimes they fight amongst themselves. This is not a conspiracy theory, but a deep understanding of actual events taking place. We, the little people, see the bits and pieces of information, but we don't know how to put it together, and emotionally we are trained not to question, but to follow. In order for the church to gain so much wealth and power, it protects itself by keeping people ignorant of their own soul. We saw this clearly during the Inquisition, but it's still going on today in different hidden forms. Now, with the Keshe Foundation plasma technology, all of this is changing. We are being taught that our soul is within us, and we don't need intermediaries to control and abuse us by lack of understanding. Please try not to read this article and think, oh, now I have understood the conspiracy. This will not help and could make us more neurotic. Instead, be open to the possibility of another interpretation like, oh, everything they told me about myself was not true. I am not ignorant, and I'm not a slave. The soul is within me. I can understand and become free to help the others by sharing what I have understood. Through this knowledge, we lose our fear. And through our intention, we share love, knowledge, peace to bring about the elevation of the souls of these leaders. This is what terrifies them most, that we should find out the truth. But for us, it is the greatest opportunity to change ourselves and change the planet. Thank you for listening. Now the summary. A question was asked about the Russian and Ukraine crisis and the idea of peace. How can we elevate the souls of both the Russian and Ukrainian representatives that are meeting right now to reach a truce? Mr. Keshe answered in a very direct way, but leaving it to the knowledge seekers to think for themselves. By showing a photo of the Pope leaving the Russian embassy the night before the conflict started, with his head and shoulders slumped down like a defeated man. By this picture, the Pope gave President Putin the carte blanche for the war in Ukraine. He went to the Russian embassy in Rome on 23rd of February 2022. In the history of the Catholic Church, this is more or less unheard of. It seldom happens, if ever, and for the Pope to go publicly there makes you wonder. The Americans and Western nations knew that the Russians were going to go into the Ukraine, and they knew they could not touch the Russian army, so they tried to arm the Ukrainians from outside. But when I saw this picture with the Pope, I knew that it was a war between two churches, the Catholic Church trying to take over the assets of the Russian Orthodox Church. I discussed this some 3 to 4 weeks ago in the American teaching and some other teachings. The war you see today in Ukraine really goes back to the wars between different divisions of Christianity. By the Pope going to the Russian embassy, he accepted the defeat of the Vatican. In this defeat, the Vatican has agreed to underwrite all the damages and costs of the war, including every bullet and every tank that Russia will use in Ukraine. The reason the Catholic Church is paying is because they went in to dominate the Russian Church. In other words, for many years now, the Vatican, hidden in the background, has been financing the incursions of NATO and American billionaires into Ukraine, both politically and militarily. The reason this is confusing to us now is because the billionaires control the media reports. So everybody believes that the current situation in Ukraine came from inside Ukraine itself, where the truth is that it has been financed from outside. Putin offered to join NATO years ago, but they refused him because the Pope was after the gold in the Russian Church. The Russian Church has no choice but to go to the Russian army to defend the Russian Orthodox Church. The Americans, Chinese, and European leaders all knew what was going on. The only problem is the public still doesn't know. The leaders all knew that the Catholic Church was poking to start problems in the Ukraine so that they could force the Russians to hand over the Russian Orthodox Church, or rather hand over its assets to the Pope, which means on the outside it will still say Russian Orthodox Church, but inside the Vatican would have control over it, like what was done to the Church of England. The Vatican controls the assets of the Church of England, and the Queen is his servant. In the end, the Russian Church would not accept it, so they asked Putin to go in and clean it out and get the nation of Ukraine back. On 23rd of February, the Pope accepted his defeat, and now he has to underwrite the losses. In the photo here, this is the walk of a defeated man to the Russian embassy in Rome. It says, "I'm prepared to pay all the penalties." Now the Russians have a carte blanche to do what they like in Ukraine. Every bomb they drop and bullet they use in Ukraine is paid for by the Vatican. The more weapons they use, the more profit they make. This was the same situation during the Second World War, when the Americans sent their soldiers to Europe. Some European nations are still paying off the Americans because they invoiced them for everything they spent, including the chewing gum. Weeks ago, I explained that there was a 99% chance that Russia will go into the Ukraine because they are trying to get their motherland back. And the Americans, with the Vatican behind them, were poking to put all sorts of things inside their country. And finally, the Russians did their job of protecting their homeland. The Americans know they cannot face the Russians, or there will be a third world war, imminent. So everybody just stands outside barking like a dog. The Russians are literally wiping out and cleaning the house out. There are two parts to this cleaning operation. First is by not allowing the others from outside to put their nuclear weapons inside USSR, which Ukraine is a part of. This is what you see happening today. The Russians will be there. They'll wipe out and put things back in order. But this is not a war. And secondly, they are claiming back the Church of the Russian territories in such a way that the Catholic Church will never put its foot again into the Orthodox Church of Russia. We could see this coming 3 and even 5 years ago. We saw the same thing happening recently in China, where the Vatican in the background was financing a war to split up China. But the Chinese confined it to Hong Kong and battered them. The Chinese paid heavily for it. Again, this is very confusing for us because the billionaires are controlling the media, so we heard a totally different story. I know this is hard to believe for a lot. This is hard for a lot of us to believe. The Vatican paid for all the things we saw happening in Hong Kong, but then the Chinese brought it under control. How are they financing? In Ukraine? They did a similar way in China. In China, they used Christians to bring the money in. Priests were flown in from Africa carrying diamonds in their bags. Then they sold them in China to finance the violence and everything else we saw. But the Chinese were waiting for them. Another way they tried doing it was to get rid of the communism by turning a lot of Chinese into Christians. If you make 1 billion Christians out of the Chinese, then the Vatican becomes triple billionaires. But their plan wasn't going to go through because the Chinese already had a structure that the people knew. And the Chinese found out, and they took out everybody that was part of the plot. This walk of the Pope is one of defeat. And for the first time, the Catholic Church had to be stopped. They warred with England for 300 years until they finally won the Church of England. At the moment, the Queen is the servant of the Vatican, and she has no more power. It's just like when one corporation takes over another. They let it run as it was. They don't interfere. Whatever you want to call it, just know that the Vatican owns it. The property is theirs. This current situation in Ukraine is an exact repetition of what happened in Europe a few years back, when the economies in Greece, Spain, Ireland, and Portugal collapsed. Then suddenly out of nowhere, miraculously, everything came back to normal. All those countries came out of their problems. This was because the Vatican did not want the Christian structure in the European Union to fail. So Vatican paid for all the debts. And then we saw immediately what I call the Rothschilds family behind it. Later they wanted to get their money back, so they appointed a German Pope. Since the Pope is the sole owner of the Vatican Bank, he can withdraw the money without question. And remember, the Vatican Bank is not controlled by any other organization. The German Pope transferred the money back to the Rothschilds. Then the Pope abdicated, or was forced to abdicate. The reason we don't hear anything about it is because the money is transferred secretly. This is the same process going on again in Ukraine. The controlled media gives a different story to the people, so that's why it may be hard to believe. Over the past decades, the Vatican guaranteed the finances for the Americans to poke into Ukraine and do whatever was needed. The same with NATO. NATO wanted to put their forces into Ukraine, but Russia finally said no, and they gathered their own forces on Ukraine's border. This is when the showdown took place, and when it was certain that Russia was going in. That's when the Pope had to go to the Russian embassy to take the guarantee that Russian forces will not cross Ukraine's border to come into Vatican territory. It's like saying you can keep the Russian Orthodox Church in USSR and we'll pay all the penalties because we were the naughty boys. The defeated man always goes to see the one who defeated him. This is a defeated man walking out of the Russian embassy. He has underwritten to pay all the damages. Now the Vatican always cashes in on their losses. This means that it will be the Catholics from the American and European churches who will end up paying for all the damages in Ukraine. Now it is clear why the controlled media has to present the Ukrainian crisis the way it does. The people who give money to the church will not be able to accept this kind of truth unless their souls get elevated to understand. This visit by the Pope to the Russian embassy was to get assurances that Russia will not cross the Ukrainian border. We will see some skirmishes, but in reality this is a war of religions, not a war of nations. In fact, it's not a war, it's a correction. It's the bringing of Ukraine back under the fold of the USSR. Another way to look at it is, if you have a brother and he is on his own, the other boys bully and attack him until the big brother comes to help him. Then the other boys all run away. But when the big brother comes, he puts his hands in the pockets of the ones who are doing the bullying, and he says, "You have to pay for the damages from bullying my brother." This is what's happening now, and the Vatican pays for it. So don't worry what's happening in Ukraine. We were watching this for some time, and we're expecting this to happen 4 years ago. The delay in it has reasons. Putin knew about it, and he was requested by the leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church to protect the Church of the Motherland. He was waiting for the Church to make that request, and then he responded. He had a reason to show his power and to protect the Motherland's Church, and that's all it is. It will not become a war, because this man walking out of the embassy has guaranteed to pay for it. In a way, if you look at it, it's punishing those in Ukraine who went to bed with the Pope. I was looking over the situation, and it will take time, and it's possible we might see a small repetition of what was done in Afghanistan by kamikazes and guerrilla warfare. They stayed there for 15 years and then pulled out because they couldn't control it, and now the Europeans are trying to show that they are doing something in Ukraine. That's because that's how they're getting involved. Yeah. But in general, they should have it under control in about 3 to 6 months. They'll make sure nobody ever talks about NATO again. People may go on the streets and do whatever they like, but the Russians will change the people on the top and inside the government so that the Vatican and the others will have no say in running of Ukraine. Because from Russia's point of view, once Ukraine goes, Belarus will go, and the other parts of the Christian side of the corridor that leads to Moscow will be opened up. Moscow would be in danger, so the door had to be closed. This is what we see in this picture. It's the walk of a defeated man. The Russian Orthodox Church is one of the richest churches in the world, and he took the risk to try to bring it under his control. The only thing they didn't count on was that the Orthodox Church would go to Putin, and Putin wanted to confirm that he was there to do the job. We were watching the whole thing. And when we saw the Russian naval forces going through the Bosporus and up, that's the Black Sea, we knew the war was on, or what I call cleansing the Vatican out of USSR. And that's when I spoke in the other teachings. You have to understand that church business is a financial business and has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with making profit. When they decide to create a war, it is a long-term investment. I explained this before. When the father dies or the mother and the son dies in the Western world, it's an investment for the church. How does that work? Let's say the Vatican pays $10 for the bullet that kills the father or the other family members. The surviving family members spend the rest of their life going to the church to pray for that one who dies. Let's say that every time they go to the church, they give $1. Add it all up over time. It's a huge return on the investment made by the church to secretly start the war. Church business, God business, is a money business and nothing else. This is why we said there will be no more religions on this planet. Because once you understand the power of the soul of the man, you do not need all this mayhem from those wearing the robes and the white frock. Look at the picture. You see the shoulders are folded in, and his head and chin are down. This is the walk of a strong man defeated, a man thinking he is strong, defeated. Don't worry, the Vatican and the Pope has never sat down quietly and accepted defeat. We have to see what they plan to do over the next 20 years in other parts of Russia and the West. We'll see more mayhem between these two churches, unless we as knowledge seekers can bring the light and the understanding that God's word is in the soul of the man. Don't worry about this Ukraine business. The Vatican has already paid for it, and they'll receive the bill every day with how many bullets and how many shoes the soldiers have used and the food they used to fight this war. The Vatican has underwritten all of it. The head of Ukraine says that the Russians will pay for everything they do and all the damages they cause. Yes, no problem, because the Vatican has already paid the Russians, and they'll make a profit in the losses. It will bring a lot of jobs to the Russian industry. This is a dirty business of religion, and we are watching many people suffering because of it. But to the leaders who are behind it, the people's suffering is irrelevant. Another time recently when the Vatican lost was when the British monarch took the gold that they all had planned to take together from Libya. The British monarchy took revenge on the Vatican for losing the Church of England by taking $140 billion of gold from the vaults of Libya. The British flew the gold directly to the Bank of Scotland, and eventually it ended up in the British government. Vatican financed a program to bring down Libya, and then they were to share all the gold between the Italians, French, British, and Germans, but the British got there first and took it to the Bank of Scotland. The other countries got together and decided to kick the British out of the EU, and they did it through Brexit. In the world of religion, the house of God never loses because it's a house of money and not of God. So don't worry about Ukraine. You'll hear a lot of hullabaloo in the media for the next maybe 6 weeks. The Russians will change the government and then get paid. The Vatican will transfer the gold from its reserves into the Church of Russia and not to the Russian government. Only those who are clever will see what's happening. Then the Russian church will pay the army's expenses, and in the end, those in Moscow will make maybe $10 to $20 billion out of it. You have to realize that Keshe Foundation has very close advisors within the Vatican, very close advisors. We hear, we know, we are informed continuously about what is and what is about to happen. A pope has never come to an embassy to ask to stop a war. The Vatican has always created a war, and in this one they accepted to pay for. The Russians were not prepared to pull their troops back. They said, "We're here, we're going to show, and we're staying, but you have to pay. You have to look. If you want to find this out, you have to look at the balance sheets of the Russian parliament to see all the expenses that the Vatican will pay for in this war." Don't worry about Ukraine. It won't go beyond the boundaries of Ukraine to Romania and other places. The Catholic Church made a move to put pressure through Ukraine on the Russian Church and to get it to bend. Ukraine went to bed with a superpower, both in religion and military forces. But you will not see the Americans or the Europeans interfering. They cannot do so because they already accepted defeat, and they obey the Vatican. The deed is already done. Now the boys will play, and some of the old war machinery of Russian army will get used up. The Vatican will pay for every tank that you see on the street, and every plume of smoke you see coming out of the back of the Russian tanks. Know that the Vatican has already unwritten to pay for it all. It will not go beyond the Ukrainian border. The only problem is a lot of people will suffer from it. And those churches are supposed to bring healing and not create suffering. The second excerpt from the 421 Knowledge Seekers Workshop. The week before, in a 421 Knowledge Seekers Workshop, Mr. Keshe was asked. 6 months ago, Mr. Keshe said, "We as knowledge seekers ended all wars. Now we are on the verge of a war that might lead to World War III. How would he explain what's happening in Ukraine?" And the second question was, whose decision is it to kill people in Ukraine? Is Putin's soul deciding those who die? Mr. Keshe replied, "Let me explain something. We don't have a war in Ukraine. I explained this very, very clearly in the American teaching a couple of weeks ago. The USSR never died. Russia it's something like United States of Russian states, was never dissolved. The USSR was never dissolved. Each country went on their own, and they called themselves what they liked. But the nation and government of the USSR was never legally dissolved. Ukraine is still part of the USSR. It's not who decides. It's the USSR as a collective group of nations of what we call the bigger Russia have decided that they're going to keep their own property and their territory of Ukraine. This is a Vatican war. The Vatican tried to attack and take over the Russian Church, which is even richer than Vatican, but they could not get into it. The state of USSR is the administrator and protector of the Russian Orthodox Church. The USSR is headed by Russia and includes 12 other satellite nations. The Russian Church has asked all of them to protect the motherland's church. This is why all the nations together are sending troops into Ukraine. They're not just Russian troops, but a union of nations. Now, it's funny, the media does not want to bring that out. No, that's so crazy. America will never go to war, and they know they are just barking like a dog, as I call it. Russia has the right to protect the assets of USSR. This is what they don't tell you in the public. Vatican is secretly financing this push, but there will never be a war. We said weeks ago that it is 99% chance that Russia will go into Ukraine to protect the motherland, the USSR. Russia is not invading Romania nor Bulgaria. Russia is protecting its structure from the pressure and push of the Vatican through NATO. They were trying to open the back door to get the Church of Moscow or the Russian Orthodox Church to become assets of the Vatican. Get this clear. It doesn't matter what you hear in the media. Russia has not moved in to create a war. Russia has moved into its own territory, which belongs to it, as the USSR. Americans will bark, but they know that they are in the wrong. Europeans will bark, and they also know they are in the wrong. There won't be a war. This is not a war. This is a correction. If the Russians don't correct this now, later there will be other civil wars, maybe in Belarus or like what we saw in Chechnya and the others. Vatican is trying to push, using NATO as their slave. If NATO can put forces in Ukraine, then they can force Russia to give up the Orthodox Church, which is richer than Vatican. This is not a war. It will never be a war. Look at it this way. If America moves Marines from the state of California into another state, is that a war? The real war is what happened in Ottawa, Canada, in the last few days. That's the war of slavery by their servants. If you know geopolitics, America doesn't have the field forces to go into Ukraine unless they do high-level bombing, like what they did in Yugoslavia. The Russian and USSR military forces have said one bomb out of Allied forces on Ukraine and will flatten out New York. Americans bring sanctions, no problems. We'll see the same pattern Russia used over the years. They will move in and change the government. Then they'll take all these leaders who started becoming rebel soldiers and opening up huge business bank accounts in America and Europe with the money they stole from the nation. Then after raping the nation, they'll escape to the West, where they have also been paid, or they'll get caught by the Russians and be taken to prisons in Siberia. I have been to one of these prisons, so I know what they are going to do with them. Then after 30 or 60 days or even 6 months, the Russians will withdraw. They install a pro-Moscow understanding of the Orthodox Church of Russia, and then the barking dogs will stop in 12 months' time. But there will never be a war. It cannot be a war. If Canada or Mexico try to take over California or some other state, the American government would move troops to protect its motherland. It's the same with the USSR. This problem has been sitting there for many years, and now this is the second time it has come up, and now Russia has taken action to correct it. The intrusion by Vatican using military forces of NATO has caused this problem. But there is not going to be a war. This is the motherland protecting its child. Russians have spent trillions of dollars investing in Ukraine. Just because you let your child leave home doesn't mean you allow the others to rape them. The motherland has to protect its children. This is what we see now. This is the correction in the political dimension in Ukraine. For whatever reasons, soldiers get killed. This is part of it. I have been very close to the affairs in Moscow and Russia and the politics in Kazakhstan for a long time. I don't support either policies or governments, but I stand very clear to see the reality and the truth of it very clearly, where it sits and how it sits. Ukraine today is still part of USSR. The Russian parliament and all the parliaments of the 13 satellite nations should have dissolved the USSR. Then Moscow wouldn't still have the leadership it has today. But as it stands legally, Even if it wasn't Putin, it would have been somebody else, because the USSR still exists. You have to understand that Vatican did the same thing with China. All that uprising we saw in Hong Kong was due to financing by Vatican. They sent priests from Africa into China with bags of diamonds to sell in China and start a war to divide China, but China became aware of it. I know exactly what is happening because we are part of the peacemakers. We know what is happening with the governments of the world. All the mayhem and the pushes of the West into Hong Kong was financed by the Rothschilds and the Vatican. About 6 years ago, one of these Rothschilds people penetrated the Keshe Foundation to destroy it. At that time, we had a big breakage in our work, and a number of knowledge seekers disappeared. It was the same process that they are using now in Ukraine. We know this because one of the Iranian guys was connected to Rothschilds. They thought that because I was Iranian, they could break through. But we found out with the help of the intelligence systems. Go back to 6 to 7 years ago and you know exactly what I'm talking about, without mentioning any names. We worked with the Chinese government, and it was isolated to Hong Kong because they became aware of what was happening. Vatican wanted to split the Chinese state, but we and the Chinese state became aware of it, and the system kicked in and isolated it to Hong Kong. In the media, we saw the battles that they had for months. But now, do you hear anything? All those leaders who got paid by the Vatican are now in government prisons in China. We see the same thing now in Ukraine. The Vatican and the Rothschilds are killing themselves to destroy the peace so that they can have the control. But it is not happening. I have no worries because this is not a war. You just see a few dogs barking. But let's see what happens. In 6 months' time, when things are back to where they should be, we might see some of the people who got benefited by NATO going in and jumping on the streets. They are what I call the free slavery of the Vatican inside. Otherwise, the majority of the people of Russia and Ukraine know exactly why the Russians are coming in. Just because you left the side gate of the fence in your garden open doesn't mean that the dogs can come in. You close the gate and keep the dogs out. It's as simple as that. They can bark behind the fence as much as they like. There shouldn't be a war unless something goes crazy with somebody in the West. I have been part of this process for 40 years, and I worked long enough with the Russians and Chinese to understand their point of view. Yeltsin once said, "Mehran has slept in more beds of the presidential offices around Russia than I have." Then you know how close we are and how much we understand the technology and the feeding of the nation. First of all, Europe doesn't have enough forces to match Russia. Secondly, if they push, Russia will close the gas pipelines. Western Europe needs that gas to survive, especially in the cold winter time. The Russians have chosen the best time to do it. If they close the pipelines, the prices will go up. The Germans and the rest will freeze, and their nations will go on the streets. It's very well planned and carried out. Western Europe relies on the gas pipeline from Russia for the heating and their life in the winter. They know what they are doing. The Americans can bark, but we won't see high-level bombing like what they did in Yugoslavia. A few field forces here and there, but Europe doesn't have that kind of military, especially with the corona, to stand a full invasion from Ukraine into Western Europe. It's not going to happen. Russia is just getting its child back home in a way which became a bit astray. They will shout and kick, but at the end, when the child's in danger, the mother will bring her home. The end.